She is. All right, you guys are gonna kick it, okay? Hello, everybody, and welcome to Word on the Street. This is the Toronto Star panel on housing. My name is Raju Mudhar. I am one of the hosts and producers of This Matters, which is our daily news podcast. We discuss the news of the day. It's available wherever you listen to your podcast, and would love if you could check it out. But really, today, what we're here to talk about is housing. And we've got a great panel. I mean, this is one of these things where this is the question that everybody keeps asking. How do people buy a house in the GTA now? With the rising expenses and costs. The other thing is this is an issue that affects everybody, whether you're renting, buying, looking to buy, or just have a home right now. So we have an amazing panel here today with some people I know very, very well. And actually, we'll start with the newest person to the Star, who I've just met. But this is Maria Iqbal. She is a 905 reporter who, before she joined the Star, she covered aging issues for the Hamilton Spectator. At the end over here, we have David Ryder, who is City Hall Bureau Chief for the Star. This man knows everything about municipal politics. I hit him up for questions all the time about things and what is going on. I hit him up this past week. And then I think, honestly, the star of this whole panel is the woman beside me here. This is Tess Kalinowski. She is the real estate reporter at the Star. I pepper her with questions about housing all the time. She used to sit pretty close to me, so this is going to be pretty normal for her because I'm just going to ask tons of questions. One piece of housekeeping. We are going to try to have about a 15-minute Q&A at the end. If you would like, there are cue cards where you can write down your questions and someone will bring them up to me. But there will also be a volunteer with a microphone. So, but at the end, someone will come around. If you have any questions, save them till then. I would love it if you help me do my job, because I'm sure I will run out of questions. So, but first off, before we get started, I talked to Tess a little bit about this, and one of the things we should talk about is our journalism and how we cover real estate at the Star. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's absolutely become something that is much more important to, I guess, everyone in the city, but also to our editors, because there is a lot of real estate coverage. Tess, I want to start with you.
Well, what I really want to know is why, if I'm the Star, you get the nice chair.
I don't know either. I don't deserve it, but
Very nice real estate.
Very good, Dave. Tess, how do you come up with your stories and sourcing?
Okay.
Sources?
So there is no shortage of housing stories in Toronto and the GTA, and in fact in Ontario-wide, because what we think of as our crisis is actually a crisis across the province and in most places across the country. There are some rural pockets. In fact, I was just looking at a Zoocasa report this morning that was saying the best place to buy a house in the country is Moncton, New Brunswick, or North Bay. Anybody want to go there? So how do we come up with our stories? Well, there's kind of an endless supply. I mean, we read other media, we watch the statistics. If you've been reading the Star lately, you probably see we're giving a lot more attention to Toronto Real Estate Board statistics, showing you a little bit about which pockets of the GTA are up, which are down, and a little bit behind those trends. I'm sure you've read about the COVID trend of people moving to the 905. So we've blanketed that issue. The other thing we look for are people often come to us with egregious stories about, their landlords or their home purchase, their real estate agent. Real estate agents call me all the time. New real estate companies call us all the time. And normally we don't cover them as one-offs, but we see if they feed into what we see as a more broad trend or issue. And the other thing I would say is, just to refer back to Raju's comment, a few months ago, the Star made the decision that this issue, housing, is probably the number one issue people are facing. And of course, recently, the rampant inflation has made the cost of living almost impossible for many families in the GTA. So we have really, really put our shoulders into covering housing. So I cover real estate, and I'm sure if you read the Star, we have a Saturday real estate section, and we have a special dedicated part of our website that is also devoted to real estate. But we also have a full-time affordable housing reporter, and that's Victoria Gibson. We have Donovan Vincent, who covers development and other affordable issues, and basically he's pretty pervasive. He backs us up on everything. And then we have our trusty team at City Hall with Dave and Ben Spur, and we have our wonderful new colleagues, people like Maria, who just pinch hit all the time for the stories we can't get to. So you've got a big team covering this issue that we know is super important to you.
I think that pretty much covers it. Yeah.
Sorry.
Listen, I was going to say, well, Maria, listen, you're new. Your editors. How important are housing stories and real estate stories? I mean, I know you cover everything in the 905, or you're a breaking news reporter as well. But has this been an emphasis from your editors to you?
Yeah, totally. So I just started at the Star in January, so right before the market hit its peak, and then had its sudden downturn. And like Tess described, we have a robust housing team at the Star, and yet still there's no shortage of stories to be told. So it's been really interesting, I have to say, to see how even the Star has been talking about growing its coverage, expanding housing coverage, to talk about both, stories that are, it's of course an area where a lot of people are growing in their interest as well. So, we've been focusing on, doing, shorter, breaking news pieces, as well as deeper dives into things, and also even developing new multimedia tools to kind of see how are changes being reflected over time. So it's been really interesting to see all of that play out and kind of be a part of it, and also pepper people like Tess with questions as well. So it's been definitely a really interesting learning experience, and also just experience learning to cover those kinds of things.
Wonderful. We're happy to have you. Dave?
Yes.
From the City Hall perspective,
Yeah.
Housing, generally affordable housing, homeless issues, what type of stuff do you guys tackle?
Yeah, I'll say, so I took over the City Hall Bureau in 2010, just before Rob Ford got elected. And I'd say the first, 8 years, housing was maybe about 10 to 20% of the conversation. The last 4 years, because of the crisis and so many people realizing that they either can't buy or they can't rent, or their kids aren't going to be able to buy or rent, and talking about having to move out of the city, it's probably now 70 or 80% of the conversation, aside from the pandemic. So it's everywhere, and it's mostly affordable housing. How do we it's Toronto community housing, which is for the people who have the least money. Then it's other forms of affordable housing, which could be within a place that has market, but also subsidized housing or lower rent. And then also a big push is what's so-called missing middle, or intensifying neighborhoods that are primarily either single family or maybe some duplexes, but trying to figure out how to get developers to want to go in and do the effort of intensifying, maybe a 5-story or 8-story, or even just stacked townhouses. And more importantly, I guess, the bigger fight, honestly, I think, is getting the residents and the politicians to accept that intensification, which is a huge issue and one that I think is far from solved.
Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, well, listen, I think the thing that we all want to talk about right now is where things are at. And, I got this from today's paper. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the cool down, but, some stats. The average home price in Toronto has dropped by 3% over the last 3 months, down to 1.21 million from 1.33 million in February's peak. Sales have fallen drastically, and bidding wars still exist, but home prices are up 9.4% compared to this time last year. Now, we know about interest rates, we know about inflation. Tess, I'm going to go with you, because I think what people want to know is, how long is this going to last? Do we know?
Wow, well, I'll just get my crystal ball out. I can tell you, nobody ever predicted that prices would be going down like this. One thing I'll say about housing in the pandemic is nobody called it. Nobody called it. No bank account. Oh, okay, you guys called it? Good, good. Why didn't you phone me? The bank economists didn't call it. And certainly the real estate industry did not see this, see how the pandemic would inflate housing prices. And as I said before, not just here, but really across the country, and sort of emanating out from big cities like Toronto. So even if I told you how long this is going to last, you shouldn't listen to me. You shouldn't listen to anybody, because nobody actually knows. Because I don't think people saw prices declining this year at all. If you asked people at the beginning of the year or the end of last year, it was going to be possibly a less robust climb, but still they saw house prices climbing, and generally they are still climbing year over year. But when they fall month over month, that means that if you bought your house in February for $1 million, it's or $1.3 million, it's worth $121,000 less in May, and that's pretty discouraging considering how bloody hard it was to get that house. Excuse my language. So, in short, I would just say, and I'll keep it short this time, Raju. I would just say I have no idea how long it's going to last. I think there's there's lots of reason to believe it will be short because Toronto is so prosperous. But there's also, bigger issues. I mean, a lot of the economic trend right now is dictated by the war in Ukraine. And if that continues, then who knows?
That's amazing. Listen, Maria, you wrote a story about buyer regrets. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the sentiment in there and some people clearly who were caught up in this and the cool down and, there are some serious issues with this, right?
Yeah, totally. So when Tess says no one saw this coming, it means even realtors did not see this coming. Like, I spoke to one realtor who told me that he got tired of waiting for the market to cool and he bought something, I think, at the end of February or early March. And after that, before his closing was this month, and he says, I saw after that, prices were going down. I could have, if I had waited a little longer, I could have gotten something better for less. And I think that is a sentiment that's resonated with a lot of people over the past few months, ever since the market hit its peak and then did that sudden downturn. So that's been really interesting to hear about, seeing stories on social media about people posting about how, they got into this deal and now they're seeing those prices go down and they're wondering, is there a way for me to get out of this? And I'll just mention one interesting kind of byproduct of that is, I guess before I get there, I'll just mention that one of the things that realtors have said is don't worry, if you plan to buy for the long term, you can always, there's no rush to sell. You can always wait the market out. But there was one group of buyers that did actually have really serious consequences, and they were people who had longer closings. And if they bought a house for 1.3 in February, their closing is in May, the bank decides last minute that they're going to appraise your property, and the appraisal comes back at short, 1 million, it's up to the buyer to kind of make up that difference on their own. And that's actually caused some serious problems with people trying to find secondary financing and things like that. So, I think it was just really when the market was at its peak, there were a lot of unconditional offers that were flying around, and people really, the market forces just kind of, forced buyers to do that. And now, they had to kind of find ways around it. So I think with the cooling down as well, we're now seeing a reappearance of conditions in offers, which I think should hopefully help with that situation in the future.
The weird anecdote I have here is one of my neighbors is selling his house, and I live on the east side of town, south of the Riverdale, and it's a very sought after area. So normally it was bidding wars galore. Their strategy has changed to right now where they are pricing high and are willing to come down. And so, they have their real price in their head, and their agent is being super, super aggressive. So it's amazing to me how that strategy has just completely turned. Dave,
They sold their house?
No. No, it's priced too high.
I live kind of in the same area as Raju, kind of like the Leslieville, sort of South Riverdale area. And when we bought 21 years ago, there was one house we looked at just south of the Danforth, and our agent really wanted to get it, and the kitchen was a bit too small. So my wife said no, and it didn't sell, and our agent couldn't believe it. And then they raised the price by $15,000 or $20,000, and it sold immediately. And we were to our agent, this is impossible. And she said, oh, it's because people put their filters in on what house they'll look at. People who were doing 300 up weren't seeing it because they priced it at 295. All to say, real estate in Toronto is nuts. I don't think you could have a crystal ball and you could polish it 100 times a day and you would still be wrong. And yeah, as far as to me, the fascinating question is, what is the absolute peak? When is it going to go up and come back and never go up to that again? I don't know if anybody knows. So when I bought, I remember having the new, we just bought and all the fear, but excitement. And I was out cleaning up the front of my house, and a neighbor with his dog walked by. Obviously, a guy lived there for a while, and he stopped and he said, I heard you paid over $300,000. And I went, yeah, a little bit. And he shook his head and said, never thought I'd see somebody pay something for that on this street, and wandered on. And I ran inside and said, we made a huge mistake. What are we going to do? And now, needless to say, our house is worth a little more than that.
Well, I think the exact same thing. I mean, we bought our house. It was, I felt, pretty high part of the market. And, of course, now it's laughable. We're lucky. I remember, actually, a real estate agent that you put me on to as a source said, I won the birth lottery simply because of when I bought. And that's one of these things that, you know, we have to start talking about how tough it is right now for young people. And I think that one of the things I want to take there is, so let's talk a little bit about some of the potential solutions and challenges out there right now. Tess, I want to start with you because one of the things that people keep talking about, supply. The easiest solution is we just need to build more houses. Now, you wrote a great piece about this. Can you talk to us a little about this and how this might not be the solution that people are sort of touting?
Okay, so I recently wrote a story just before the provincial election talking about this issue of housing supply because at least the three main parties were going off a report that was issued earlier this week by a group of mostly developers who said the solution to home prices in the GTA is to build 1.5 million more homes in the next 10 years. That's roughly double the rate of the last 10 years. So that's a lot of houses. And we're going into a situation where trades are stretched. There aren't enough people doing skilled building trades. Prices for construction materials are through the roof. And it's a difficult situation. So I actually initially had some skepticism about the ability of the province to do this. But then I started talking around to people who, you know, one guy, this guy, Joel Roberts, he did his dissertation on what drives housing prices. And he draws a direct link, and so does a guy named John Pasalis, who informs a fair bit of my reporting. They draw a direct link to interest rates, and everybody can see that. Rates go up, sales go down, and when sales go down, prices are usually down, and that's exactly what's happening. But a lot of people also note that builders aren't in it to make money. So they can build, they're building for profit. So they don't want to flood the market with houses, right? Or homes or apartments. And the other thing is, when they do build, again, they build for profit. So you don't see there are a lot of new rental buildings actually in Toronto right now. And most people can't afford them because they're they're luxury buildings. There's no slowdown on the price of custom homes and luxury homes. As we had a story a few days ago saying the Bridle Path is not seeing any kind of deflation. Neither is Rosedale or Moore Park. So I just think this whole, I haven't found anybody who says supply is not an issue at all. It is an issue, but I don't know that, you know, just flooding the market with houses is going to work. They have to be affordable to more people, and they have to be right-sized. I mean, we all know there are a lot of one-bedroom condos in this city that are on the affordable end of things. And yeah, they're nice starter homes for some people, but there are also a lot of families of 3, 5, or more people living in one-bedroom condos and as renters or as owners. And I don't think that's what we want for our community. So I would just argue, because Queen's Park is going to start up again and we're going to start talking about this again, I would just ask you to keep your ear sort of turned for the nuance of what that supply should be, where it should be, and who it should serve.
Mara, you recently wrote about a new rental report, and this is the thing. If people can't buy homes, obviously they're going to have to rent, but that's also really, really tough right now. Can you tell us a little bit what was in there?
Yeah, totally. So the rental report also predicted that rents are going to continue to increase, which is tough, of course, for people who are already priced out of the housing market. And when it comes to, I guess, the one I guess, good thing is, like, with the ability to work from home still for the most part, people are able to find places out of the city. But again, there's predictions that, you know, the suburbs will become more and more expensive because people are going more there because they can afford more space there. But at the same time, there's some potential, like with work from home, you know, that means that there is a potential oversupply of office space. And I think that's one area that's been kind of highlighted as, you know, a potential area where that extra space could be turned over into residential development. So it is kind of an interesting, like, we're in an interesting time right now. We don't know where that's going to go, but that's one of the solutions that's been kind of put forward by people, and I think that's pretty interesting.
Dave, you mentioned this a little bit before, and I want to get into it. Density. This is
Yeah.
one of these things, in Toronto, there's not a lot of, you got to fill in spaces.
Right.
But this is one of these things, whenever people talk about it, no one ever wants it in their neighborhood. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the NIMBYism at play with some of this stuff.
Sure. So I'll say, NIMBYism is a loaded thing. A lot of people will say, well, I love my neighborhood, I love my home, and I want it to stay the same. And that's understandable. The hard thing is there's a housing crisis, and a lot of those people would agree with it. But I'll just say that, like, at City Hall regularly, there will be a public hearing for either putting a new homeless shelter or modular housing, which is a supportive housing, which is basically usually like a small apartment block that is the next step up for people who were homeless. These are buildings that they would move into, not forever, but for a period of time with intense support. So they'll have social workers, harm reduction workers, kinds of things. And then the idea is they move on, they can get their own place with other supports. And if they follows a pattern, I've been to so many of these meetings and I could almost write the story before I cover it, which is city staff will give a presentation on why we think this place for people who can't afford just market housing, why it should go here. And then residents associations or individuals will get up and argue against it and vehemently argue against it. And the usual thing is, we believe homeless people should have a place to stay. We don't support homelessness, but, and then there will be a bunch of arguments. And they will be a bunch of arguments that are never two things. It's never, I'm afraid my property values are going to go down, and it's never, I don't want to see poor people in my neighborhood. It'll be all kinds of other things. My favorite that I've seen maybe 3-4 times is a member of the Residents Association is obviously being dispatched to kind of read through all the rules about where shelters or modular housing can go. And they'll come up with one, they'll say, this is not on an arterial road, with kind of like, aha, flourish. And then the city staff person who has been through this many times will leap forward and say, a lot of people assume it's not an arterial road, but if you read it, it actually is. And then the person kind of gets deflated, and then they look madly down their list, and then they try and throw a couple of other things out. It usually doesn't work, especially homeless shelters. Actually, most people don't know. City Council passed a rule years ago that actually you can't really stop them if it fits all the criteria. If city staff screwed up and it wasn't arterial road, they could get it moved. But it's actually an as of right. But the supportive housing I was talking about is not on that list. People can and do and will fight it. And the interesting thing, there was a story I wrote about in Willowdale. There's a supportive housing building that is proposed in front on a big green space in front of a Toronto community housing building. There was a lot of community support for it, but there was also a lot against it. Stan Cho, the local Conservative member of provincial parliament, took up the residents' cause and convinced the Ford government, which is all about building housing, to say no to this project and to override the city approval of it. Now, the city can still get it approved, but it has to go through a long, arduous process that will take years and be challenged at a bunch of steps along the way. So that's the kind of thing. The fascinating one to me about that is a lot of the people arguing against this supportive housing unit are tenants of a Toronto community housing building who would have faced the same kind of arguments when their building was built 20 or 30 years ago. They would have had the same people saying the same things about, I don't know these people, what are they going to be doing in the middle of the night? So it's that's kind of the thing. I think it's, to draw a very imperfect comparison, to me it's a little bit like climate change, where people will acknowledge there's a crisis, but at this stage they really don't want to change their day-to-day lives. And so people will say, I know housing is a problem, I know my kid is going to have trouble buying a house here, but I really don't want to have 2 front doors on a house, which is, I'll explain that. A few years ago, there was a change at City Hall that said, we're going to make it easier for people to build secondary suites within their homes, basement suites, that kind of thing. That got through council, but there was a proposal that would say, as of right, you could put an extra door on your front house so your tenant can just go downstairs. A lot of people, like the area Raju and I live, it's very dense. Sometimes there is no side door because the other house is right next to it. Councillors rejected that. 2 front doors would change the character of the neighborhood. So you can still get it, but you have to go through a long zoning, and you have to let your neighbors weigh in on whether 2 front doors will ruin their view or your neighborhood. So we're still in that NIMBYism. Everybody agrees it's a crisis. A lot of people, especially outside the downtown core where there is density, don't want their neighborhood to change in any way.
it's one of these things too. I find that because of the cool down, we aren't talking about a bunch of the solutions that they were throwing around just literally 3 or 4 months ago. So I do want to have a little bit of an update on a couple of these things. First off, the ban on foreign buyers. I believe that's something like 1.5%. Tess, is this going to do anything?
I haven't found anybody who thinks so, because it simply is. There's a real misconception about who investors are. I think people are under the impression that it's big high rollers from Asia and big corporations. And I'm not denying there is a move that way. There is a move by corporations to buy up housing. However, the majority of condo investors, which is what most of you think of when you think of investors, are actually what we often refer to as mom and pop investors. They're people who have managed to scrape together the money to buy a house, but they hang on to their condo as an investment, hoping that they can carry it on the rent and achieve the equity on the other side of it, sell it off for a lot more money because housing goes up. Or they're just people who are investing for their children. I've done a few stories on condo projects that were aborted by the developers when they looked less profitable than they hoped. And the majority of people who get scammed in those are actually people who plan to live in them, or they were buying them for their children. So, I don't think I'm sure the foreign investor ban will do something. I just don't think it will do that much to bring down prices in the GTA.
The other one that I wanted to update on is the Liberal promise to end blind bidding, which, again, I remember talking to you about this, and you were like, it's not that big a deal, but... and there's also all these talks about people, thinking it'll turn us into a place where we have, like, auctions, like in Australia, of houses. Any thoughts about that?
Sure. I guess I don't... there are people who say that blind bidding has driven up the price of housing in Toronto. And I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I think, in some cases, people have actually overpaid by hundreds of thousands of dollars above the next bid. And, is that fair? I don't know. If you were selling your house, would you think it was fair? You might. And the auction thing, you get the same kind of argument. I think auctions are a coming thing. I actually do. I think there are companies that are sort of spreading their wings here. And so far, the province has not done anything to clip them. But, they're fair. But I talked to a bunch of auctioneers for a story recently, and they said, auction fever is real. Even though in Toronto and Ontario, it's usually done online, and people are not just blind bidding, they just don't see the other people at all. But they said, yeah, it's exciting, and it, people do get caught up in it. So, it's possible to drive up prices that way too. I'm not sure that, outlawing blind bidding is going to make a real impact on our affordability issues.
Well, Dave, this is one of those things that I think it goes a little bit back to that NIMBYism, but let's talk about political will. And, all politicians are talking about this because it's a huge issue. But in terms of actually doing things, it's one of these things that, it seems like they're sort of nibbling around the edges. And I think one of the things is like, listen, I don't think there's a politician out there that wants to be blamed for, like, me losing value in my home, right? And,
right.
And who are the people that vote? Homeowners, right?
Yeah.
So, like, you see these people in action. What do you think they're trying to wrestle with here?
Well, I would say that on homeless shelters and the supportive housing end of things, there is more political will than there was before, because people recognize it's a crisis. I think at least partly due to the fact that we have, for a short time, more Anna Bailão, who was the city's housing advocate, and she has sort of made it a mission, and she has got John Tory and others on side, and she's sort of a centrist, so she's done a good job at getting the left and right flanks of council to go along with things and say this is a real problem. The bigger, wider issue is the densification, and that I don't think there has been, as I said, like the example with allowing basement suites, but putting kind of rules on it, that there is not been any movement. And that is, I think, because you have Toronto Council has always been dominated by suburban councillors. There's just more of them than there are the downtown ones who, couldn't really say no to all the office towers even if they wanted to. But it's easier for somebody in Etobicoke, where I grew up, or Scarborough, or other parts of the city, to listen to, even if it's a small residents group, like maybe 100 people out of 120,000 who live in their ward, but who yell and say, we'll campaign against you. That, I would say, the political will, I don't know what it would take. You would have to have somebody like John Tory get those suburban councillors in a room and yell at them or threaten them or say, you have to allow densification, and a 4-story apartment building is not going to really change the neighborhood. And I think that's the thing that kind of drives me crazy as someone who grew up on the western edge of the city, as suburban as you can get, and has lived in kind of more downtown. Like, it really doesn't hurt your quality of life that there are densification. In fact, like, I'd look at the Queen Street restaurant strip, it's made it better. And also you get parts of the city, like, I don't live in Rosedale, but I cut through it a lot. There is like a lot of different kinds of housing in Rosedale. There is like $6 million mansions next to 50-year-old rental buildings that are 4 stories, and the world does not stop. And the fact is, those houses in Rosedale are still worth a lot of money. So it's how you convince people, and it sounds like I'm slamming the councillors, but it comes down to the residents, because they're the ones who will decide if someone's going to re-elect or not. How to convince them that densification is not only can not only needed to help the crisis, it can actually like make your neighborhood more vibrant, because there are a lot of parts of the city where the people don't want anything to change, and the population is actually shrinking because people are dying, and there's no way for more than one family to replace them.
That's not just parts of the city, though. It's like 70% of the city.
Right.
You should talk about garden suites and the appeal.
Yeah.
I was gonna listen. I do want to talk about some weird, some of the weirder housing stories, and like we heard about laneway homes, but garden suites. Yes, I mean.
Well, let Tess handle it. I mean, I've talked about. Well. I mean, I'll say that garden suites just one of those more examples of ways that you can take a single family home and somehow add a little bit of density or gentle density to it. So, I mean, we all know, like, laneway housing was proposed as being a big solution. And the fact is, some is getting built more than before, but it's going to be a tiny fraction. And often laneway suites, I've seen some of the ones in our neighborhood, they're kind of like not cheap. Like, they're maybe $750,000 for a pretty sweet house on the back of property that somebody could build. So all those kinds of things, garden suites, laneway houses, I mean, it's all part of the solution, but it's not radically going to change things.
No, but I think you have to mention, too, that city staff put this huge amount of work into into laneway suites, and then they wanted to expand the concept of a secondary home on the lot to garden suites, and they got it through. They worked really hard, and they listened to people, and it's gone to appeal, which means it could be many years until the majority of the city could actually build these things. A lot of the people that I've talked to that are interested in building these homes are interested in building them for their parents, their children, their grandchildren, and surprisingly, many of them for themselves. They want to downsize in their own neighborhood.
Yeah, and there's 2 things I'll just say to that. One is on a tangential thing. So I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and I remember there was a friend of mine, an American guy, who had bought, he'd married into a family that had a big lot, and they built a beautiful house behind it. And as a joke, I said, if you could, like, sell this, you could move back to America, because Japanese houses are so expensive, you could live like a king. And he said, no, there's a big taboo here. If you sell, you're dooming your kids never to own property. I kind of feel like Toronto is kind of like at that stage, where I'm like, I thought maybe we'd sell our house to fund our retirement, and I'm like, then I guess Ben and Tess never own a thing, because if they want to stay in Toronto. So that is part of it. A lot of the laneway housing is my parents move in there, and then maybe eventually we move in there and our kids move in there, which is going to potentially help but not solve. The other thing that Tess raised is approvals. Is we can talk a lot about what the city can do or what the city hall should do or what they're not doing, but the fact is there's appeals. It's got a different acronym, but there is still a provincial appeal body. And as we saw with Doug Ford's cut to council and the Supreme Court decision that came, the city of Toronto, as big as it is, as powerful it is in some ways, is a creature of the province. We're a puppet of the province. And if they decide they want our housing solution to be done, they might let it go. If they say no way, it doesn't happen.
Mario, this is one of these things. You wrote about iceberg homes, and personally, I love that story because I made a joke about it. If Batman lived in Toronto, he would need an iceberg home for the Batcave, right? Is this the city we want? Can you tell us a little bit about what an iceberg home is and what are the issues with that?
Sure thing. So you might remember back in the fall, there was controversy over a mansion in Hogs Hollow where a number of trees had to be cut down, including, I think, like a 250-year-old tree, to make room to build this massive multi-level basement. And we were really interested in knowing whether that was like a one-off kind of thing, or are there more houses like these in the city? And we learned actually that there are more, and it's been growing, especially in the pandemic as well. Like you'll hear about 7-car garages that are subterranean, or golf simulators in people's basements and basketball courts and things like that. So it's really the flip side of the housing crisis. What are the uber rich doing during this time? Which is fascinating. And so one of the things that people spoke to me about is how during the pandemic there were limits on travel and things like that. So that turned people toward investing more into their own homes. And so there's been a rise in that. And what's interesting too, I guess from a city perspective, is that there aren't that many regulations in terms of how far you can build downward, and how far out, how deep and how far out. So that's kind of something that is still in the works with the city. They're looking into that, and there's been in London, UK, these kinds of houses are much more common, and they've introduced a number of regulations about that because they found that digging deep also led to basement flooding and things like that. So there are ramifications for the city as well, and so that's something that I think we'll hear more about in the coming months and next year. But definitely something interesting and I guess out of whack happening in the city.
Listen, if I was uber rich, I'd build a Batcave. Tess, this is one of these things where I remember a while back you did a number of stories about just some of the crazy things. Well, yeah, crazy things. But some of the new ways that young people were trying to band together with their money and buy houses. I think you did a story that did really well about a bunch of roommates that did that. Did you hear anything more about that? Or did that spur anything because as young people trying to get in this market?
Yeah, it's not just young people either. There's a lot of issues with seniors because there's not, it's hard to downsize in this market. Nobody wants to sell their $2 million home to buy a 700 square foot condo, really. They don't have room for their stuff. They don't have room for their kids and grandkids. It's a problem. But yeah, I think there's, honestly, on the realistic front, I don't know how many people are doing this. Some of you might have heard of the Golden Girls in Port Perry. The story I wrote about was on a street called St. Clemens in the West End, near Bloor and Lansdowne, or College and Lansdowne. And it was a bunch of young people who actually were not initially roommates, but they all bought a house together. And it was a task to make it work. I mean, the guy who led it was a bit visionary, and he kind of co-opted all his sources and all his friends to create the legal agreement that would allow them to have a way out if they needed one, that would commit them for a certain period of time, and sort of talk about what happens to the profits when the house gets sold. We assume it's profits. We hope it's not losses for them. And it probably is. They did a lovely job fixing up the house, and great group of young people. So I've also written about a couple of couples that bought under the same roof, but there are now realtors, and my main source is a woman named Leslie Gaynor, a remarkable person. She's a realtor, and she's also kind of got a social conscience, and she has really facilitated a lot of these kinds of moves. But when I say a lot, I'm thinking we're talking a dozen or 2 dozen as opposed to how many people buy a 1-bedroom condo and move into that. So that's what I would say about that.
Well, I think I'm pretty much out of my questions. So unless there's anything you guys would like to add or address, I'd like to open it up to the audience for a little bit of a Q&A. So I think we have someone with the mic going around, or there's some cue cards. But again, sorry, is there anything anybody wants to add or say at this point?
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming. Thank you for being a great audience.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to boil it down to one. I live in North York, where we have intensification of a very different kind. A lot of huge homes replacing perfectly serviceable single-family homes. So I don't see those disappearing at any point, and how you intensify around those homes is, I don't know where you're going to put the intensification. The other thing is we have not heard anything about co-ops, because co-op seems to be dead. And yet a co-op model, if it was done properly, would be just such a wonderful possibility. I mean, it's not the whole thing, but it would be a certain thing to add into the mix. I live in a co-op. My rent is so much cheaper than it is for most people, and I'm paying full market rent. And I mean, that's just two issues that I'm concerned around. And if we're going to intensify, like, how do we actually make it work? Because what I see happening when they do build homes for people with more, rent geared to income suites put into it, it's only for a certain period of time, 10 years, 20 years. What happens to those people later, or the people who move in later? Because the assumption is made that over time people have enough money to live there, and the way things are going, is that really going to happen? So I don't see how we're solving. And the other, one more thing to add, is we seem to not believe in rental as a way to live, that somehow you want to have a house. Somehow a house is your goal, or an apartment that you own. Like, renting seems to be a bad thing. And yet in many cities around the world, people rent forever. Like, we don't have that. And if people rent, they're afraid the landlord's going to raise the rent and, do all sorts of things and kick them out. So rental becomes something only transitory. So all those things are things I'm concerned around.
Well, there's a lot in there. It's funny. The renting thing is an interesting point, because I think this is one thing. I talked to a gentleman who was with an organization, and it was all about sharing generational wealth. And they were talking about how one of the things that we as homeowners have to do is change our mindsets about this. Basically, our homes can't be this thing where we think that they're going to go up forever. And so obviously some of us are facing that right now. As in terms of your other queries,
well, I can add a little bit. I mean, as far as people buying the lot next to them and building monster homes, there's nothing to stop that, and I've never seen a proposal to stop that. I mean, it's there's all sorts of criteria when teardowns. Yeah, I've covered some of the hearings when there's like significant neighborhood opposition for one reason or another. And there's all sorts of reasons, but the fact that it's the opposite of densification or that there's a housing crisis is not one of the reasons that would ever be brought up. So I don't see anything stopping that. Co-ops is a great question. And in the last federal budget, I believe, there was $1.5 billion across the country put aside to try and get something going on co-ops. The fact is, we don't know. It's not the federal government is going to come to Toronto and build them. I think we need the city and the province to work together. I don't know what the Doug Ford government, where co-ops comes on their radar. I don't have any sense right now that it's like a big priority. Having said that, I know there are co-ops. I know the St. Lawrence neighborhood. There's the Bain co-op in Riverdale that are extremely successful. There's long lineups for people to get in. And when a lot of people get in, they sometimes I've known one family where they stayed until they can save up equity to buy. But other people, they'll live there for the rest of their lives. And if anybody knows, has seen it, it's basically everybody owns a share in it and you run it together, and it's a nonprofit. So I don't know about you. I've heard 30% less than market rate in many cases. And in many cases, these aren't, like, I think some people think of, oh, it's going to be like a broken down kind of like, and often they're beautiful. The Bain Co-op, it's arts and crafts, and, and people work together. Of course, it's like a condo, but worse in that you really have to cooperate together, right? A condo, people can walk out and they'll argue about whatever, but they have their own little space. Whereas this, everybody's kind of really working together. So people have to shift their mindset, I think. And I know there was one situation where I took my son to a birthday party at the Bain Co-op, and the kids were all going to play in the common area, and the guy who was in charge of the big composter had turned it over that morning, and now it really stank. And the mother was yelling at him like, "Harry, I told you not to do it today." And he was like, "It had to be turned over." So there's going to be that kind of stuff. Like, it is different than single family homes. But that is, I mean, anybody who knows, like, who has watched British shows, council flats, people grow up, which is a municipal owned but cooperative form of housing. People grow up in them. There's no stigma. It's just another way of living. But for some reason here, the dynamic really is rental or own your home.
Well, I think I actually did some research on this for a long time, and I think that pot of money is not enough for co-ops. But the biggest obstacle to co-ops in the Toronto area is the cost of land. The cost of land is astronomically high, and my understanding is, groups come together. There is one in Toronto, and the name escapes me at the moment. They come together and they want to build one, but it's virtually impossible to afford it for a group of families or a group of individuals. Be interesting to see, BC has done it, but they sort of have a more socialist leaning than we do. And I just want to say something about your tear down comment. And that was, I don't know how we stop people from tearing houses down and building bigger ones. I know how we can discourage it in some places. And I'm thinking of a story I did in Long Branch just before the pandemic about a fellow who wanted to build 2 homes on his huge lot, which had a tiny falling apart bungalow. A great guy, great lot, and his neighbors wouldn't permit it. They put up so many obstacles because of the character of the neighborhood. They didn't want to see a multi-unit home go there, and so at the end, he had no choice. He built a great big, I don't know if I'd call it a monster home, but that's where he was leaning. That's what he was going to build. So when you don't permit multi-unit housing, you're actually encouraging the wealthy to suck up those lots that could occupy more people. And that's really unfortunate to my mind.
Thanks. I just was wondering, planning has to have such a big effect on this, because if you look at the older areas of Toronto, there's all kinds of mixed housing. I live in Etobicoke, which suburb. On the river, hundreds of big, huge apartment buildings, because I don't know, we decided it's actually a good place for them because there's lots of place for people to exercise down the river. And then, but in real ritzy areas, there's all these little 4-story walk-up apartment buildings. On Anglesea, there's like 20 of them. So how did they get built, and how do we get the planning changed so they continue to get built? Because the planning now says we can't build them on these little streets.
Yeah, exclusionary zoning was a huge deal prior to the election. One of the things in that report I mentioned earlier about the $1.5 million housing push was to get rid of exclusionary zoning, which is, I referred to Dave earlier, like 70% of the city is zoned only for single-family homes. And I don't know how they got there in the first place. I'm assuming the zoning changed, or, there are little pockets of different zoning in established areas here and there. But the province backed away from exclusionary zoning just before the election because they knew they were going to have a fight on their hands in terms of municipalities. And I know there's a big push in planning at City Hall here. I suspect there are many people who would like to see the end of it here. Not necessarily suburban councillors, but, downtown, I think people think, let's open up the zoning so we can densify these neighborhoods. But again, it is a political will thing, and until we're convinced that we have to build better for our children and our grandchildren, I don't know how you persuade people to get rid of their property values as they perceive it. I'm with Dave. I don't think it affects your property values, but people see it that way. And, we live in a culture where, people don't have pensions, where they're counting on that equity in their homes to fund their retirements. They view their homes as an investment, and that makes the argument harder in a way.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think you really, to do what you say and to get back to where we had that kind of mix, you really have to make it a right where almost like residents can yell and scream and stomp their foots, and it's almost like it's a very hard political fight to get there. And I'll just add one story. Is I remember this is the 2014 election, I think. I went to interview a councillor named Frank DeGiorgio, and he was a suburban councillor in York. And, I said, so what are the issues? And he started complaining to me about how his area was not getting Section 37 funds, which are the funds when builders build usually condos or developments. If they want to go above what the city allows, they can pay money that basically can be used for city amenities around. So it'll like your playgrounds and community centers and all those things. But you have to have the development to get the Section 37. So he finishes this, and it finishes, a big woe is me, we're not getting it, it's all going downtown. And I said, okay, Frank, like how many projects are there in your ward? And he said, none. They wanted to build one, but I had to stop it. And I said, but Frank, like that's what you get it for is intensification, and you get the money. He said, the residents didn't want it. So that's what you're up against. And it's a difficult thing.
Well, where is he now?
Yeah, he got defeated in 2018.
Okay, we have another question to the audience. I'm going to read these cards. This first one is not a question, though, but it's a sentiment, though, I think that we can discuss a little bit. I moved from Toronto after living here for 30 years to an area I can afford 1 hour to the northeast. Great price for a home, but locals call Toronto ex-residents cityots. So there's that to contend with. Now, I think the question I want to ask about that, though, is obviously we heard a lot about the Great Migration during the pandemic, and everybody leaving Toronto further out, causing those prices to go up. So, Tess, any idea where things are at? Are people trying to move back in, or are they settled, or? And everybody hates people from Toronto anyways, right? That's just the thing.
I don't know. I can't say I've not heard cityots before. I don't know. The prices are going down faster in the suburbs than they are in the city, but they are going down in both cases. What goes up sometimes comes down harder, I suppose, and suburban homes were the thing in the pandemic. I think so much depends on the workplace. It's all about the commute, right? The traffic is insufferable already, and everybody isn't back to work, so that doesn't make it any more attractive. So I think really we need to look at our employment leaders, and that has big impacts on downtown, and it's a super complicated question, but I honestly don't think we know yet.
The federal government has introduced a $40,000 tax-free savings account toward the purchase of a first home for people under 40. Are the provincial or municipal governments having any similar incentives, such as an Ontario tax incentive and maybe a break on property taxes for a couple of years? I don't think I've heard anything about that.
I know of nothing at City Hall that would give you a break on property taxes. The only break on property taxes you get is if you're a senior or low-income senior who the idea that they would be forced out of their home by the cost of their property taxes, and they can basically defer taxes, and then when they either move or die and the whole home is sold, then the taxes have to be repaid. But I know of nothing right now on a proposed, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tess, that on the city of Toronto would help people buy their first home.
No, there is a move into governments looking more at shared equity programs where they help you buy your first home. There's a cap on how much you can spend, but I don't know anything about property taxes.
Okay. Question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe I'll go a bit off tangent, focusing on condos, because that's one thing that I don't really read often when I read about real estate in newspapers. The quality of the condos, which is terrible, and the other thing is total lack of recognition of the climate crisis. The condos, the way they're built, they cost a fortune to cool down in summer. They cost fortune to heat them up in winter. Why the city of Toronto, whoever, won't impose any kind of regulations of developers? Because basically what I've heard, I talk with a person from architectural firm, and they would say, we designed the building to make it super efficient, minimize the energy consumption. The developer would just laugh at us. No, scrap it. We just want the cheapest possible option. So why? And I'm kind of really disappointed that I never really read about this when I read about real estate. Addressing it sounds to me I hope I won't say something really outrageous. The city in Toronto, if it's in the developer's pocket, they just go for the kill, build a shoddily designed condo, make a fortune, run away, and people are stuck in those aquariums with windows wall to wall, a ceiling to the floor. Why nobody's doing anything about it?
Okay, a lot to unpack there as well.
Yeah. I will say I don't think the city is in developers' pockets. I would say the downtown councillors primarily who oversee the most development are on council would consider the most progressive and, you know, the most eager to impose environmental regulations, the most eager to try and make those developers pay for the services as opposed to just building and running and not having to pay for the schools and the other things to provide for those people. As far as the quality, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm working with a colleague right now on stories about what Toronto would need to do to meet its target of being carbon neutral by 2040. And I'm doing more of the vehicle part of it. My colleague's doing more of the building part of it. But I know she's looking at issues involving condos. So I hope I'll check to make sure she's addressing that issue. I will say that, like, just from what I know from talking to her about the housing part, that would be a huge thing. Like, just retrofitting, like literally retrofitting every building in Toronto to make it more energy efficient, to stop having, like, to have no natural gas appliances, no natural gas stoves essentially in Toronto to meet that target. There's all kinds of things that would happen. So I assume condos would come into the scrutiny there. I mean, a lot of those condos are built and the developers are gone. So then you have the extra costs weighing on the condo owners and their corporation, which is a big thing unless the government comes in with big subsidies. But I don't live in a condo, but I have no doubt that what you're saying is true.
This is a big question from the audience. The focus here is on housing, but how do we connect this to other essentials like the cost of food? I mean, obviously, this inflation is everywhere, but, you know.
Well, I think if you, as the majority of people in Toronto do, pay more than 30% of your income to housing costs, makes it a lot harder to afford food. So I think, yeah, you know what? We need to draw that line more often. You know, there's a lot of people who talk about that stereotype of, you know, am I going to eat or am I going to keep a roof over my head? That's a reality for a lot of people. And we do need to focus on a more holistic view of that. I don't think in the consumer basket of goods that the government counts as the inflation rate, I don't think housing costs and rent are included. That I've talked to some economist types who seem to think that would be a good idea because our inflation isn't because it doesn't take housing into account enough. But you know, if there's an economist here who wants to correct me, I'm good with that too.
Listen, I believe we're out of time. On that note, I want to thank our panelists, David Ryder, City Hall Bureau Chief of the Star, Maria Iqbal, a 905 region reporter for the Star, and Tess Kalinowski, the real estate reporter for the Star of the show, as I said from the beginning. I'm Raju Mudhar. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your patience. And I hope you have a wonderful word on the street.